So I'm here this morning with Christopher Marks. Christopher is head of emerging markets at the Japanese mega bank MUFG, and he joins us from London. Good morning, Christopher.
Good morning, Regis. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. First, I would start with a very basic question for people who don't know how involved MUFG is in Africa. Can you briefly tell us what you actually do in this continent?
Of course, thank you. The bank formally has offices in Johannesburg and in Cairo, but in terms of practical engagement, the bank has a presence through different forms of exposure, advisory work, direct financing in between 12 and 18 countries at present.
Okay, so actually working on this topic, and I know absolutely nothing of Africa, it's striking to see how localized the growth still seems to be. Where do you see the potential for Japanese companies in Africa today, both as a market and as a production base?
Well, I think if you look at the evolution of growth in Africa generally, you'll see a striking trend which the multilaterals like the World Bank have highlighted. You have a group of relatively fast-growing, diversified economies that are no longer reliant on an older model of the export of primary commodities. And then you have a group of very large economies, many of which are still reliant on the older model, primarily being commodity exporters, of which South Africa may be an example. Certainly countries that are reliant on oil and gas exports, like Angola, have not done as well. They're growing relatively slowly. Nigeria probably sits in the same category, although it has a very large domestic market. In contrast, you have some of the smaller, or what we think of as smaller jurisdictions in West Africa, and that includes countries like Côte d'Ivoire, like Senegal, like Benin. And then equally in East Africa, you have some of the middle-sized but quite dynamic economies in Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda that have moved to provide very interesting, more sophisticated layers of economic activity. And it's precisely, I would argue, that in these more diversified, more interesting destinations for Japanese corporations, that the continent today offers a more interesting perspective for generally quite high-tech and relatively sophisticated Japanese exports, rather than the older model of simple infrastructure or simply thinking about the extraction and export of primary commodities.
So what are the domestic hurdles to the growth that are still remaining? What are the ones you think that will be removed over the years, and what are the ones that seems really hard to get away from to get out of the way?
I mean, I think if we talk about the continent as a whole, which, as you know, is always difficult. There are 54 countries. They are many jurisdictions that are quite middle income. We're talking everything from South Africa all the way to Morocco, as you know, that are quite mature, diversified, sophisticated economies with well-developed legal systems, relatively predictable governance regimes equally. So leaving some of these larger destinations aside, I think the questions of governance, of course, predictability in terms of the rule of law, from that comes the notion of sophistication of government interaction with the society. We have quite a diversity of arrangements between the government's weight in the economy and in some countries quite a liberalized, if we think using liberal in an economic term, liberalized regimes where we have decentralized provision of public services. That could be everything from urban infrastructure to energy. And that creates, frankly, a more open environment. Because I think when we talk about growth, I think in the context of our conversation, particularly with Japan in mind, it's a question of where do private corporations coming from outside, where are they able to support, be helpful, and find opportunities for themselves? So governance is clearly one. The question of African trade, and gets back to a point we touched on earlier about intra-African trade. The older model in Africa was the export, of course, internationally, and therefore Africa was very dependent on the terms of trade, which, as you know, has been a challenging environment for many decades. One of the big objectives is to reinforce intra-African trade between some of these more dynamic regions. Last year, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area agreements were signed. This was a very important step forward, even conceptually, in the manner of watching the European Union, with all of its strength as a collective, impose itself globally and facilitate more intracontinental trade. I think the Africans have watched that experience very carefully, and they know well that in order to be a serious partner and to attract outside investment, they need to offer opportunities within the continent. So that agreement, in addition to governance, the rule of law, and frankly, the notion of a more diversified economic opportunity set away from the older model of exports, is really where the continent is headed.
So, preparing again on this topic, I was surprised that usually people speak about individual successes of countries, the Rwanda miracle, South Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, and so forth. So I was wondering if Africa itself as a topic was not a kind of smoke and mirror in a sense, because it kind of dilute the power and the interest of the country that seems to be. I know you, for example, you worked on Ghana a couple of years ago. So I wonder if the big picture does not sometimes serve as a kind of tree that masks the successes that are very impressive, but that are just here and there.
No, thank you. I really welcome the question, because it's, and I speak as someone who has worked on the continent since the late 1990s in different forms. And there is, as you know very well, a perception of Africa as a continent, a perception that relates to political instability, areas of deep poverty, and often political stress. And therefore, as I've described this evolution with a new generation, and I think this is really an important point for listeners to appreciate, at the level of governments today, and I say this as a private sector partner, you have a new generation of political and economic leaders that are sophisticated, open, they are peers for people like myself in every sense, in terms of their willingness to push ahead. So as you say, if we move beyond parts of the continent, and again, there are 54 countries, not all of the 54 countries are in any sense commercial destinations for commercial actors looking inside. And precisely as I've said, the continent can be divided between diversified, progressive, forward-looking jurisdictions with strong human capital. And I think it's part of rethinking who are the people we partner with and why. Why would a Japanese corporation with expensive, high-tech, sophisticated exports deal with older model economies that need simple infrastructure and are simply exporting? And precisely as we discussed, some of those success stories in West Africa and in East Africa, that is the way in which we build up some of our understanding of what constitutes the economic opportunity. As one last comment, the potential of the continent in the broadest sense is in large ways, and I make the reference to human capital, based on the youth, the dynamism of the economy, and as African governments become more sophisticated, you have examples such as Ethiopia. It's a very interesting example. It's a big country. It's a big country with both a large domestic market and a very nice implantation close to the Suez Canal, close to Europe, and with a large investment experience to build factories to compete with Bangladesh, to compete with Myanmar, to compete with Vietnam in terms of the production of either textiles, clothing, relatively low and medium technology content products, because the labor costs are, of course, very competitive, And it's the kind of platform where certainly Japanese corporations, as well as other investors from Asia, can make good use. So you see, the continent is operating in a different frame today. We have examples where we can use platforms like Ethiopia in order to export clothing to the United States, which they do. We do have partnering arrangements between the Japanese and more sophisticated African partners in order to export value-added goods into Asia and elsewhere, not simply exporting raw commodities. So looking down inside of the continental shell is not only so much picking countries, as you said, there are a few examples people like to refer to, but it's more these dynamics of diversified economies, a new generation of leaders, and frankly, the openness. And it takes political confidence to be open economically. There's a confidence to open up some of the economies the way the Ethiopians have, even in that example, which had been historically a very old regime state development model. I'll stop there.
You mentioned the terms of trade, and one of the challenges seems to be where the value is produced. So an often mentioned example is coffee beans leaving Ethiopia, for example, at $2 and arriving in the US at 17 or 18. So the whole value still seems to be outside of the continent. Do you see this value within the value chain moving towards Africa, towards its origin, or?
It's a vital question, and it's a vital question which can be looked at two levels. Number one, it is unquestionably true that we have a network of trade arrangements, processing arrangements, and it could be for cacao, it could be for coffee, or for other products that have been placed for a long time. And therefore, institutionally, it is true that it takes a little bit of deconstruction of some of these arrangements, but I think there is no question the willingness and the determination of African leaders to break out of these established chains, which creates uncertainty, right? If you're exporting cacao from Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, the two countries represent 60% of the world's cacao. The chocolate comes from, it's a West African product. And you have entities, companies like Barry Callebaut from Switzerland that have worked for a long time in these countries, very established networks. But even there, the presidents of the Cote d'Ivoire and of Ghana had formed a cooperative arrangement, which is also hard to do if you think of the cross-border complications of any trade arrangements. They have created an arrangement to make sure that exports do not leave those countries without an initial layer of processing taking place at home. Exactly as you said, to capture some of that value added at home. Now, that's a relatively well-known example in the cacao market because of the weight of the production coming out of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. But you see examples of that elsewhere, and that's part of the logic equally of the African continental free trade area. So that the notion of capture of domestic value at home, not only simple commodities, but even some light manufacturing equally, as with our example of textiles in Ethiopia, or we could use cotton equally in West Africa. People don't think of Africa still, except for Egypt, as a cotton exporter. In West Africa, Japanese companies are building textile processing plants. So the cotton is not simply exported back to a 19th century vision of things, but the textiles in raw form are dyed and made in Africa and then are exported often to India and elsewhere for further processing. So it's an interesting transformation, exactly putting on the points that you've said. And again, it's not a countrywide phenomenon, but it's really a set of priorities for the new generation of leaders. They need jobs, right? Let's think very practically here politically. You have to have factories to hire this young generation of the population that have come into the cities out of rural areas, and they need engagement. They need to make money.
There is an argument that is often made about Africa that is leapfrogging technology and so forth. And I always found this argument a bit, I don't know, I don't find it conclusive. It's probably doing a lot of great things for the country, but I guess you lose something when you just get directly a finished product and you move from there. Maybe it gives easier access to mobile money to people who didn't have coins before, of course. But what are the merits and demerits of the leapfrogging argument, in your opinion?
I mean, it's that even the word leapfrogging, of course, is a hopeful construct. And I think, as you say correctly, I don't think we should somehow capture the continent's progress or human development in these terms. However, I think in certain sectors, of which the arrival of mobile telephony gives you an example of how a young population raised entirely on these new technologies creates a potential base for moving the continent forward and allowing populations access to different sectors without having to go through 30 or 40 years of building up older industries and then moving forward. So the question of not only mobile money, which is quite celebrated as an example, but it gives you an insight. You have generations of, and this is hundreds of millions of people in Africa that will never go inside a bank, for example. Since I'm much older than you, I will say I can remember going back originally with my parents to get my first checkbook. No one in Africa is going to see a paper checkbook. At the same time, you can distribute money, you can take loans out using your mobile telephone, and other development agencies are thinking, how can you advance the use of the telephone to capture other examples? In the solar energy space, for example, there's a lot of programs in East Africa and now in West Africa as well to have solar systems put in people's homes, as you would expect. Access to energy is a big challenge. The payment for the solar energy is done entirely by the telephone. The recording of repairs, the request for repairs, the ability to order additional components, things that in the West we do in different sectors in a commercial and consumer context. It creates great potentiality in Africa, again, to provide access to energy. If people don't pay, the system can be turned off through the mobile telephone. So you see, you even have an entire logic of how to finance these activities, even in informal economies where you don't have traditional collateral. One last example using the mobile telephone, and you see what leapfrogging means in practicality. Even though we don't yet have a cheap enough smartphone for mass distribution on the continent, even for populations with older phone technology, farmers are able, for example, to export their crops. There's a commodity exchange in Kigali in Rwanda, in which farmers deposit their grains in silos and sell them at auction every 3 months entirely through the telephone. These are not necessarily literate farmers all around the East African region, and that logic of working through the telephone gives them access to markets, just as we do with the internet in our consumer societies around the world. You have economic sectors, as people get better and better about defining applications, that allow the society, as you say, to go leapfrogging in a sense that sector by sector, they're able to get access to modern services, but through different devices. So it's a very compelling logic. It is not a panacea, as you correctly say, but you start to see, as we get better to plug into these new dynamics, how different technologies can be applied.
Maybe a last question. Can you maybe share with us a couple of African successes that probably I don't know or I'm not aware of? Rwanda is often quoted as a kind of very IT-oriented country, extremely efficient. But I guess there are a few others that may come to mind and that may enlighten the audience.
I think there are, as I've said, in West Africa and in East Africa, some of these smaller, more diversified economies, I think great potentiality. And I think, again, as a London-based banker and investor, and someone who spends his time bringing investment to the continent, the ability of large corporations, and I'll answer your question not so much picking examples, because we've talked about the Cote d'Ivoire, we talked about Ghana, talked about Senegal, and of course Rwanda and Kenya in East Africa. But it's the ability of large partners to choose African countries rather than going to Southeast Asia, for example. No one is surprised if Japanese corporations go to Vietnam. They're also not so surprised as they go and invest for factories, for investments, for re-exports across the Indian subcontinent, places like Bangladesh equally. Those kinds of investments, both for simple manufacturing, and we mentioned the examples of manufacturing in Ethiopia. There is automobile manufacturing in Kenya. There is motorcycle manufacturing in Kenya. Buses are manufactured both for export and elsewhere, all across West Africa. The notions of agricultural investment in terms of processing, and I'm making the Japanese reference here, there are Japanese corporations that have established whole production units in Senegal, for example, for tomato processing, for exports all across the continent. Examples in Morocco. Now, I know Morocco is quite a sophisticated destination, but Japanese automobile manufacturing, and this is full construction, not simply assembling in Morocco, but this is full production, everything from simple components like tires and seats and leather goods, all the way to the cameras. We can't build a modern car today without a camera for backing up. So companies like Panasonic have moved their production from Spain into Morocco. So you have several dozen companies in the automobile sector, all Japanese, to put down their whole production chain. And I think Morocco may be a relatively advanced example of where we can go. But these are sophisticated supply chains across the entire range of technologies that are able to find a home for predictability, for the quality of human capital, and of course, access to markets. Because that production in Morocco by the largest automobile manufacturers in Japan, both Toyota and Renault Nissan, they export both for Africa and this is the important part, the quality is good enough, it is exported north into Europe as well. So these are the kinds of examples that again, we build up slowly in Africa, but this is the great potentiality, and this is why big Japanese corporations like Toyota Tsusho have made investments in partners all around the continent. And I think this is one last point I'd like to make. And again, using the Japanese example, Japanese corporations like to partner. They come in a very modest fashion. And I think they embrace the opportunity set by working with partners of which French corporations are good examples that have worked on the continent for many, many decades. The Japanese bring in their supply chain and distribution knowledge, and they plug in to corporations like the French shipping and logistics company Bolloré, like the older commercialization and distribution entity CFAO, which is it's an old colonial inheritance in French West Africa. It is now owned by Toyota Tsusho. It's remarkable. And you see their ability to expand across French West Africa, Francophone West Africa, in everything from distribution, of course, of manufactured goods, but also production of consumer goods at home, and then moving up the value chain as well. So I think this is the opportunity set now, and the ability of large corporations to find abilities to manufacture, to add value at home, to find a willing population that is well educated enough, very efficient in terms of relative labor costs, and governments and the new generation of governments that are thinking ahead and understand that the old model of economic development, the old model of exports without value added at home is no longer practical. And these are dynamics that take change, they take time, as they have everywhere else in the world. But there's no question that this is the direction of the future, and this is where opportunities lie for partners such as MUFG and all of our corporate clients that are looking to find opportunities. Africa is growing, the resilience is strong, and there's a lot of opportunity.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for sharing your experience with us today.